Hey nerds, Todd Simmons here again with another video showing you a little Toddautomation. Today I want to talk about private keys and GitHub repositories. More specifically, what you need to do in order to work inside a private GitHub. Now, I'm going to focus this on Ansible Automation Platform. For those of you who are familiar with Ansible, Ansible Automation Platform is the newest release or the rebranding of what used to be called Ansible Tower. So when I say Ansible Automation Platform, it's basically just the most recent version of Ansible Tower. Also, there's another GUI-based version from Red Hat and IBM called Ansible AWX. This is the free, non-supported version of the software. It's open source. This should work in there as well. I don't have AWX up and running right now, but I know there's a lot of similarities between the two. There is one more flavor of Ansible. It's called Galaxy. It's a CLI version that you can run inside Linux. I will not be doing any CLI versions as far as, talking about Ansible Galaxy. Playbooks run the same in all four versions, so that should work. But today, I'm specifically talking about the GUI versions of Ansible. So anytime I say Ansible, please realize that I am specifically talking about the GUIs at this particular point. So let's talk about the issue that led me to this video. So when you're working with Ansible, all of the GUI versions, they're going to be using containers, right? And those containers are kind of like the wind, right? They're there when they're there, they're gone when they're gone, right? So working with containers can make things more difficult because it's not like you can just save something to the local directories, right? So if you have special modules, and this is what really led me to this video, is I write some custom Python modules that I call upon that are not packages, right? They're just, quick Python files. And I need to get those Python files into the controller or to the local machine that I'm running code on. So there's two ways that you can solve this, right? You can place those files in a GitHub repository, and mine I primarily use private, or you can create an execution environment, right? So if you're going to place those in a GitHub repository, right, and you're going to have to log into that GitHub repository to get that information, and I prefer to do that in a secure method using SSH. So if you do not know how to set up your machine to securely connect to GitHub via SSH, I'm going to put a marker here that shows you another video that I created that shows you how to do it. The second method is create an execution environment. I will create a video for that one. It's not created yet. And in that execution environment, you could put all of your custom modules in there, but that's for another video. So let's move on. So when you clone a private repo, or when you attempt to clone a private repo, there's a problem, right? You're going to have credentials that are called upon from your playbook. Now, the way that Ansible works as a GUI is it logs into your repo the first time, but it doesn't reference that same credential, right? Whether you're using an SSH credential, hopefully, right, a private and a public key, like I showed you in that other video. It doesn't reference that again. You're going to have to put it inside your playbook in a different manner. Now, if you're looking to clone a public repo, it's easy, right? I mean, there's no authentication to cloning a public repo after you've actually logged into your own. So it's very, very simple. So we're not talking about that. So once we go to try to log in, if you've ever tried to clone a private repo inside Ansible, you'll notice it just sits there like for a long, long time. I remember the first time that I ran it, when I thought that I actually made it work, I was really excited. And after about 3 minutes, I was like, it doesn't take this long, but, I was nervous. I was like, I don't want to stop that template from running, so let me just let it go for a little while. And I let it go for about 15 minutes, and I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. it's not working. And I was right, it wasn't working. It was waiting for login. When I say it, I made the request to do a clone in a playbook of that repository, and it was just, GitHub was just sitting there waiting for a response to log in, and I don't think it timed out. I certainly know that once I tried to let it sit there just to see how long it would go, and after an hour it was still sitting there, and I just, I had to click on the button to cancel the job that was running. So after much research, I found a way to actually fix this issue. And once again, this issue is going to allow you to get to your private repository to use some of your custom modules that you cloned into that controller. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. So when we do this, in order to create this custom credential, we have to use either YAML or a JSON format inside Ansible that tells us about the credentials that you're going to use. And then you'll be able to pull those credentials from inside your playbook. Now, when we do this new credential type, it has two primary areas of what we call an input area, which is just the attributes of your particular credential that you're going to use, which we'll go over step by step. And then an injector. The injector is the important part. The injector allows us to use the extra underscore vars variable section inside of a playbook to be able to call that variable in that we associate with our template file that we're running from Ansible. So really, really important part. And then it actually injects it into the playbook and it makes that login happen. So I'm going to be using SSH with private and public keys. Obviously, the private key is going to be on my Ansible controller that I'm using to log in, and the public key I've already put on GitHub as a login. So if you haven't already put public and private keys in place, I recommend watching my video. I'll do a tag here that shows you where that video is on how to SSH to GitHub. So go ahead and watch that video and come back here once you're done. So you're going to need to be able to create those keys or reference those keys in this video that you created so your Ansible instance can SSH, because we're going to use those secure keys from that playbook. I'm going to call that private key with inside Ansible to authenticate to be able to get to my private Git. And I'm also going to specify that inside the credentials here in a very secure manner inside Ansible. So let's move right along. I know that some of the images and items on my screen are going to appear a little large. The reason being is I've watched a lot of videos where they were sharing their screen like I am, and you couldn't see it. It was very, very, very difficult to see. So if it looks like an eye chart, it's supposed to be, right? Or it's not supposed to be, so I apologize. It's not supposed to look like an eye chart. So I've zoomed as much as I possibly can with this with the screens that I'm going to share with you. So real quick, the screens that I'm going to share, I'm going to leave my PowerPoint up there just because I like to be able to see it when somebody's talking about how to do something, kind of see the steps that they're taking. So I'll certainly keep the PowerPoint up here. You'll notice down here I use secure CRT. The only reason I have that up is to be able to go copy and paste my private key. This is just an SSH to my Ansible Tower controller or Ansible Automation Platform controller. So I can go grab that private key when I need to actually put it in the GUI. You'll see that I've got my Ansible Automation Platform GUI over here. I'm going to switch screens just a little bit, and I also am going to be able to show you my VS Code to look at the YAML, more specifically the playbook that we're going to run. Now, if you don't know how to link your VS Code to the GitHub repository that you're working with, I'm going to put a marker in here that shows you how to go to a different video and set your VS Code up to connect into your GitHub. And if you'll notice, I am connected down to the GitHub down here. You can see I'm connected when I mouse over my main branch, that I'm connected to Python_collection, and it is a Git. So these files are actually on my GitHub right now. that we're going to connect to a little bit later on in this video. So let's go back and get started. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to create a new credential type. This credential is not on Ansible by default. So we're going to create a new credential type by going to the hamburger. That's what I call these three buttons up here, the three bars up here. I just call them the hamburger. And then we're going to go all the way down to administration, and we're going to go to credential types. Okay, so from credential types, if you have not done this before, this will be blank, right? Because all the default credential types are in there. So you would want to click add, put the name of your credential here, and then its description. Now, I've already done this to make things just a little bit faster. So I'm just going to go back to credential types. The credential type that I created, its name was private repo login. Okay, and the description that I used was used to log into a specific GitHub private repo. Now, the SSH is going to allow you to connect to any private repo that you want inside of your account for your repository. So just know that. So the first thing that we want to look at is the fields. Now, I said before, the fields, this is just telling us what it is that we're going to be using. Okay, so it's just one. So as you can see, it comes up in a list, but it's just going to be a list of one items. And inside here, we'll have an ID. The name of the ID is just going to be GitHub _repo private. It's going to be a string. This label is going to be very important. This label is what's going to show up inside the credential when we actually create the credential. So you can put anything you want here. I've just called it private cred. Secret, true. We want to make sure that we enable this for true because it's going to encrypt it for us. Once again, all of my videos should be showing you how to do things securely unless I've specified otherwise. And then multi-line, very, very important. That this is going to be a multi-line credential. Why? We're going to use a private key, and the private key is obviously going to be much longer than a single line. So we need to have the multi-line equals true. So those are the fields that we're going to identify. Down here in the injector configuration, we're going to specify a file and the extra vars, right? So the file is just going to be, these are default, this is default information associated, at least the template.mykey is, and then we're going to use the Jinja 2 format. If anyone here does Python, you might be familiar with Jinja 2. Playbooks also use the Jinja 2 format. I'm probably going to do some videos on Jinja 2 just because with the network configuration stuff that I do, I really work a lot with Jinja 2, and it's a pretty incredible language in itself. Anyway, so you could just copy and paste or look at this or put this in there exactly the same way. Extra vars, super important here again. This secure key is going to be the variable that we're using. So when we call this variable out of our playbook, that's the name it's going to be using, right? And the tower.filename.mykey, right, which is over here, how we're identifying that is how we're going to get that key. Okay, now notice we haven't actually put in any keys. We're just creating the type using the input configuration fields, the injector configuration file, where it's going to get this from, the file, and then the variables that are going to be called. Now, notice I did this as YAML. Okay, one thing I will tell you is if you put the double quotations in here when you enter this, because I did, I'm used to using double quotations inside these. Ansible is actually going to change that and just make it single quote. So if you come back to it and they're like, oh man, I didn't put it in there like that, just want to let you know, save you some time, Ansible is going to do that for you. So this is it, right? So you've got your name, your description in YAML. You have to have these fields, right? And actually, I'm going to put these fields in the comments so you could copy and paste them in each of the sections, as long as YouTube lets me do that. I hadn't tried that before. And then you would hit save down here because you're first creating it, right? So it should look like this over here in my PowerPoint once you're done. So I'm going to go back to credential types. So you would come here, whatever you named it. Like I said, mine is private repo login. That's what it would be from here. Now, you've created the type, but you actually haven't created the credential, right? So remember, just creating this credential type is going to allow us to do two things. With the credential type, opening this back up, we're going to reference two things. This label, very, very important, okay, private underscore cred, and we're going to do that next. And then this extra vars, this secure key. This is what we're going to do inside of our playbook. So make sure that you remember that. This one actually is going to pre-populate when we create the credential, but this one you are going to have to use that variable later on in our playbook. So make sure that you remember that. Okay, so now that we're done with credential types, the next thing that we need to do is we need to create the new credential. And that new credential is going to be the specific inputs that we specified based on the YAML that we created on that credential type. So once again, we're going to go to the hamburger. Instead of going to administration like we did before, we're going to go to resources and we're going to go to credentials. Now, you're going to see all of your credentials in here at this particular point, right? So what you're going to want to do is, if this is the first time that you've been here, you're going to go to add, you're going to create your credential type, right? So the name would be, I'm just going to call this Todd Test. Okay, you can give it a description. You don't have to give it a description. I like to use organization, so I'm going to choose my organization. Now, when I choose credential type, it's got to be based on the name that you gave it in the other one, which we called it, at least if you're following the video, the private repo login. Okay, so when you do that, here's that private cred. Remember, we talked about it when we went through here and we looked at our credential types and we chose that credential type. Here's that private cred label. So that tells you that that field, private cred, right, is what's going to be used inside the file and then called in by these extra variables, right? So sorry for jumping around a little bit there, but let's go back to your credentials. Okay, so I'm actually going to call this Todd H. Simmons GitHub credentials, and it uses the SSH key. So when you're looking at it, this is what it should be like, right? We've got the private repo login that we selected. Now, yes, I've already created this credential, but I am going to show you how to finish it off, right? So we've got the private cred, right, that we specified before. Now, I'm going to remove what I'm using in here. Now, this is an incredibly important step. Once I figured this out, it took another couple of days to figure out why it didn't work. Now, I'm going to show you exactly what you have to do to make it work. And it's a little strange because it's the only time that I've ever encountered this. Now, you need to have some sort of SSH connection to your controller or the platform that you're running your Ansible GUI from to be able to go get that private credential. Once again, if you haven't created the private credentials, you're going to need to do that in order to continue. So I'm logged in as root. I created the credentials as root because when Ansible is going to make all these connections, it's going to do it as root. Once again, we talked about containers, right? So depending on how you're running your Ansible Automation Platform, right, it's either using Docker containers or Podman containers. Red Hat uses Podman by default, but you have to get this information into that container, but it's still going to be using the root logins that you specified here. So as you can see, if I do a pwd, I'm in the root directory. So I'm just going to cd to the SSH directory, right? This shouldn't be new. And now I'm going to do a cat. And the file name that I used is Git Hub. So just to show you real quick. So if I do an ls in the directory, you can see I've got a couple different types of key files. So I've got the GitHub key file, which is just your typical SHA-256. And then I've also got the ed25519 type, which actually is the recommended type when you're from a GitHub perspective as far as creating that SSH connection. But for this one, I'm going to use my GitHub credential just because I marked it easily for GitHub. So I'm going to do a cat, and then I'm going to do a GitHub. Now, everyone should remember that the GitHub or the name of the credential without a dot something notation is going to be your private key file. And then the .pub that you see in here is actually the public. Now, I'm only interested in my private key because I've already put my public key up on GitHub. So I'm just going to cat that out. And then I'm going to copy this entire key. Now, I know that you can't see my key because I'm going to, for security reasons, I'm going to blur it out. But I'm going to copy this entire key from beginning to end. Okay. Just so I don't have to clear this throughout my video, I'm going to just clear that. So now that's gone off my screen to be secure. So now I'm going to paste my private key in here. Okay, so there it is. That is my private key. Okay, now it looks a little funny. The zoom that I'm using that's making it look so funny. So you'll notice if I come down and I go back into a normal zoom, you can see that my private key looks just fine. Okay, so know that that's correct. I'm going to go back into the zoom just because I want everybody to be able to really see my screen. So here's the issue. When we did the SSH, and we did this because, right, this isn't the first time, if you followed my videos, that we created or we used a private key for Git, because when we're logging into the Git initially, right, before we're trying to copy the Git, I showed you how to do this. Now, here's the issue. If you do this and you leave it just like this, which should be perfectly acceptable, it will fail every single time. Now, it took me days and searches and searches and searches to find out exactly what went wrong. So let me show you the fix. Are you ready? That's the fix. So thank you, Stack Exchange, and whoever found that out. I did not come up with that fix. It literally took me 2 days to find the fix. And somebody on Stack Exchange had said, hey, try putting a carriage return, new line character, whatever you want to call it, after your private key. And what was happening is when it sends it through in this multi-line format that we specified, remember, because there wasn't a carriage return or the new line symbol after that private key, it doesn't send that end OpenSSH private key portion of your key through and caused it to fail every single time. So hopefully that saves somebody 2 days of time. So just to show you that it all looks correct, when I go back down to the normal screen size, I'm going to save that, and that's it. So now I have my private key associated with this Todd H. Simmons GitHub creds. Okay. And I forgot to put the PowerPoint up there that showed that, but super duper important. Once again, I want everybody to remember, you've got to put that carriage return, or that enter, that new line character out there, or it will fail, fail, fail. Now the good news is it'll fail in seconds, not in 20, 30 minutes like it would before. Okay, so now that we've got our new credential, and let's just verify that we've got our credentials. So when you go down to credentials, you can see your type credentials over here. We're looking for anything that's called private repo login. As you can see, I've got a couple. I've got a Todd Git private credential, and I've got a Todd H. Simmons GitHub credentials. Once again, the GitHub credentials, if you look at it, you go to edit. Remember, this private cred, that's what's super important, right? That private cred is what's referencing the credential that we created before, right? So I'm going to go back in here. So we're going to create a playbook, and then I'm going to run that playbook from Ansible. So I'm going to put just a demo up there. This can be any playbook that you have. Once again, it does need to be in a private Git repository because if it was public, you probably wouldn't be here. Right? So I'm going to switch over to my code. Once again, if you don't know how to link your VS Code into your GitHub repository, check out my other video where it talks about doing so in order to do that. So as you can see, I've got this git clone test, and it's a YAML file. It's just a standard playbook. This playbook has a couple of tasks inside of it. To be more specific, it's got 3 tasks that we're going to look at. So let's start at the top real quick. The name is just the name of it, right? And it is identifying just the global parameters here. I'm only going to run this on localhost, right? This is specifically for trying to do this on your Ansible controller when you're running things. If you were trying to run this on something else, you were still trying to do the git clone, fine, you probably would have more hosts. I'm not interested in gathering the facts. I know the facts. It's my controller. The variables, I'm using a directory called temp Python collection. and that's the directory that I want things created in, so I'm just using a variable. And then I have my tasks. So my first task is I'm going to enable the GitHub global SSH key. So that's the item that we just created. So remember this secure key, right? Just to show you, let's go back here. And if I look at this secure key and I go back into my credential types, right, and I choose my private repo login, secure key, right? This is how I'm going to call the credential that we just created through this secure key, okay? Once again, very, very important. I want to make sure that you know where we're kind of linking these variables together, okay? So then my first actual task, other than defining my variable, is going to be to clone my private repo. So here is the repo, so git at github.com, right? So that should immediately tell you, well, that's SSH, right? Git at github.com is SSH. I don't want to use the HTTPS, because in the HTTPS you have to include, right, your username associated with your Git and your token, which shows up as clear text when you do it. We don't want to do that, right? But we covered that on the Y in a different video. The key file, once again, is now we're going to pull this variable that we created here, and we're going to use that key file, right, when we go to log in. Now this Git is just part of the Ansible collections for Git, right? If you're like, well, why don't you have the Ansible default or Ansible collections Git? You don't have to if it's a default. So I just call it Git here, right? The destination, right, is where I want that GitHub repository that I'm cloning to be, and I'm specifying in temp and Python collection. And I'd be like, well, Todd, why put it in temp? Because you can actually write to temp inside of Ansible when it's running as a inside of its Docker or its Podman, right? Whatever container type you're using for this, that will actually access that folder location inside that container. Are we wanting to clone the GitHub? Yes, we are. And are we updating it when we do so? Yes, we are. So the delegate to, very, very important, right? We're delegating at least here onto our local controller. So we want to specify the delegate to inside the Git to our local host. Okay, so that's what's going to call that key. Now, I threw a couple of things in here just to show, hey, did it work, right? So the next part of this playbook, we're calling its name just to say see if the files from repo are expected. So I'm going to run an ls-al, right? AL, show all, L list, right, for the options, because of course this is inside Red Hat. Not Linux specifically, but Red Hat Linux. When we're running this, if you're on AWX and you're using something other than Red Hat, right, because you don't have to use Red Hat for AWX, for Ansible Automation Platform, they certainly recommend it. That's what I did. But that ls-al to that directory should work just fine. I want to copy the contents out as a variable, so I use the register, right, because the register identifies what the variable is going to be. And then a debug, I want to spit that out inside my playbook after it runs. So that's it. That's the entire playbook that we're going to run. Okay. Now that we're going to run that, we have to put it in a project. So if you're familiar with Ansible Galaxy, Ansible Galaxy just runs the playbooks as playbooks. It's different inside the GUI versions. The GUI versions have 2 steps instead of just that one. You have to have a project, and then after your project, you have to have a template. That project must be run first. But the playbook, this playbook actually gets run in the template. You might be like, well, what do you need a project for? Well, the project is actually going to tell you what playbooks are available. So you have to have a project, you have to run that project before you have a template. So let's jump back in to Ansible, right? And we're going to go to projects. And it's under resources, okay? And we're going to do an add, okay? And the name is going to be Todd Private Repo Test. I'm not going to give a description. The name is a pretty good description here. I like to use organizations. I assign a lot of things to my organization, right? My execution environment, we'll talk about these in another video, but I'm just going to use, as you can see, I only have the default ones that are installed with Ansible Automation Platform. I'm going to use the Ansible Engine 2.9 execution environment for this, so I'm going to select it. Source control type is going to be Git. Now, if you're at this point, you're like, well, hold on, Todd, I don't have a Git source control type. Well, then I need you to go to a different video, because this is how we're actually going to log in to GitHub initially. This is not working in pulling things out of the private repo. This is just a secure login, right, in order to get to my GitHub repository. So now we look into type details. We need our source control URL. Okay? This is simply the private Git that we're going to work with. So if you don't have that URL already, so we actually want to jump into it. So here's my GitHub. We're going to go look at your repositories, or specifically my repositories. I know the repository that I'm interested in is this Python collection. Okay, I'm going to go and click on the down arrow next to code. I'm going to choose SSH. Okay, and then I'm going to copy that location. That's it, right? That's going to be my source control URL. So let me minimize that. I'm going to come into source control URL and paste that in there. Okay, so it's the Python collection Git. The source control tag, you don't have to put this. I like to put main in there by default, just because that's typically where I'm working. And then the source control credential, we're going to have to choose that, right? So I'm going to use my GitHub SCM, right? Source control credential, or source control module, and it's the credential for it. Once again, if you're not sure what you're seeing here, go ahead and go to that other video that shows you how to securely log into GitHub, because that's what this is. Okay, now I don't need any other options here, right? Actually, just to make it match, I'm going to use my Tower GitHub SSH. So the PowerPoint over here matches, right? So all this is the same, right? You can do a description if you want, and then you save it. Now, as soon as you save it, right, it's going to immediately go into and try to reach that GitHub. It's going to look through all of the folders that you have, because Ansible's real good about going to look through all those different folders and see if it finds anything. Okay, so as you can see, I didn't have to do anything after I saved, and its last job status went into successful. Okay, so let me just show you that again. So if I went to Todd private repo test, this is the one that we just created. Okay, you can see it was last successful, but you can sync it again if you want, going down here. It's running, and then it was successful. Okay, if you have any questions on this, right, you can always just go back up to the hamburger. You could go to jobs. The jobs is really nice. It's going to show you all the jobs that were run. Now, you might be like, man, Todd, that's hard to read. I understand. Let me show you what it looks like normally, right? So it's much easier to read if you're not totally zoomed in like I am. But like I said, I didn't want this to be an eye chart. I wanted everybody to be able to see it. So when you open it up, you can look at the output, and here's your output. Now, I have very, very verbose output turned on at this particular point. Okay, so if you're like, you know what, that's too much information on the output, not a problem, right? Go back to your project, okay, and inside your project, we can edit it. Actually, it's not there. It's in my defaults. I'm sorry. In my defaults, I have it set up. So let me just show you that real quick. So inside the settings, when we look at the job settings, and I'm going to go ahead and make this just a little smaller so it's easier to see. Okay, you can see that the run project updates with higher verbosity is turned on. Okay, so just you put that back to normal size, is turned on. That's why my verbosity on the output of those is so much higher than what maybe you're used to seeing, because I like to be able to see it all. So if I go back to jobs and I open it up again, so that's why I'm getting all this verbose output. And you might be like, well, why do you have it like that, Todd? It's quite simple. When none of this worked, I was trying to figure it out. And if you don't have verbosity turned on, it's really, really difficult to see what happens. So if you're not sure what's happening, turn on your verbose output the way that I just showed you. But here's the cool thing. So here's the OK. This is the local host. This is actually the login, right? We told it to track. So we're getting it after before. We're looking at change. We made no changes. All we did was log in with it. Here's all the information that we have. The SCM version, right? The Ansible facts. Nothing was changed. But we were able to log in and see our information. So you can see our local host. OK was 3. This runs by itself, right? This is just a project. So the project has now run. It's hit my Git, and it's been able to pull down any of the information associated with that Git. So just to go back real quick. So in the playbook section of my files, in my Git underneath playbooks, I have 2 of them. I've got AP check and git clone. And what that project did is it went and found all the playbooks that could be run. So the next thing we're going to do is look at a template. Now, if you're trying to run multiple playbooks, you either have to link the playbooks inside that playbook or you have to do a workflow. Now, I don't want to talk workflow. I just want to talk template. So we're going to go back to Ansible over here. This time we're going to create the template. So we're going to go to templates. From templates, we're going to add, we're just going to do a regular job template, not going to mess with the workflow right now. So select the job template, and we're going to call it automation private GitHub repo clone. You can put a description. My name is a pretty good description. The default run job type is run. The inventory that we're going to use is localhost only. And if you have a question about inventory and where I got this and how I specified localhost only, I'm going to put a marker for another video that I created that shows you how to create an inventory with just localhost. That's all we're doing right here is running it on the actual controller node. We're going to choose the project. Now, this is the project that we just created. So when you do project, only the projects that are successful are going to show up in here. So we're going to do a run playbook on GitHub private repo. Select that. Now we can select our execution environment. I'm going to go with just the default that I did before. These don't have to match. By the way, your execution environment can be different for the project versus the template. I keep them the same. Now, playbooks. Notice here, there's 3 playbooks. Well, when we looked at the code before, when we looked under playbooks, there was only 2, this AP check and this git clone, but we have 3 here. The reason being is there was actually a copy of this playbook that was left in the TLD, the top level domain for this. So when you hit the down arrow, you're going to see it found 1 in the root directory, the top level domain for this Git. And then the playbooks directory had these. So it actually went and found them all. Even it didn't matter that it wasn't marked playbook. So we're going to run this git clone test. Okay, credentials, real important. Here's what we've been doing, right? We're going to go to this credential. We want to change our credential from machine credential to private repo login. We're going to use the Todd H. Simmons GitHub creds that we just selected. Going down to the rest, we don't have to do anything. The verbosity I'm going to change as normal, right? We saw it very, very verbose on the project. If we wanted to do that here, that would be connection debug all the way. I'm just going to go verbose. If you were on the CLI and you were used to doing things in Galaxy that way, this is how you would specify the dash VV, V, V, V. And the number of V's determines the level of verbosity that you want. Going back over here, we're going to bring the PowerPoint back up and make sure that this matches, right? So git clone test, all the same. Looking at the bottom, the only option that we're going to choose here is this privileged escalation. We want to run this as root, and then we're going to save it. So from here, it comes back to just the details pane for that template. Now, unlike the project, it will not automatically run. So you can go back to templates and look at it. And the way that the templates are listed by default is by name. I wish they had an option to by last created, but they don't. So you actually kind of have to search for it. So here it is here, the one that we selected. You can either click on it and select launch, or you can just go to the rocket over here. I'm going to go just to the rocket over here. I'm going to launch the template, and here it goes. So it's running, as we can see here, and we're going to wait. And here comes our output. right? We only chose one level of verbosity and successful, right? I was really happy to see this the first time, so hopefully you are too. Because then it worked, right? But we were expecting it to work at this particular point. So looking back at it, you can see all the different steps that we ran, right? So, you know, the enable GitHub, right? So it used the local host. It got that secure key. So, it had a variable associated with it that it was able to use. Then we were able to clone the private repo. As you see, it took 2 seconds from .39 to .41. So it cloned it immediately fast. There were no large files in this particular repository. And then see if the files from the repo are as expected. So what we did is, we ran a command and then we had our task debug to actually print it if we needed it. So when we look at it, we can click on it. There won't be any standard output or standard error on this one, but we can look at the JSON response and you can see inside the JSON response, it had 20 entries when we did the ls-al, right? And here we have directories. As you can see, we've got multiple directories in here, which this does match what we saw inside of our actual Git when we look at the directory structure over here. So it worked. It ran. It was able to log in. You were able to clone a private Git repository, which is going to be the first step for a lot of different things that we might want to do. So thank you very much for viewing. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments. Like, subscribe, and we'll talk to y'all later, nerds.